I was told my aunt needed professional care, but the truth was, her 4 successful sons just didn't want her anymore. I remember the first time I walked into that nursing home. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else I couldn't quite name, something quiet and forgotten, like time itself had slowed down inside those walls. My aunt, Margaret Whitmore, sat by the window in a narrow room no bigger than a walk-in closet, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she were waiting for permission to exist. At 68, she still carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity. The same woman who had once hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 20 people now reduced to watching strangers walk past her door without ever stopping. They told everyone it was for her health, that she needed supervision, that living alone had become too much for her. But as I stood there, looking at her untouched coffee growing cold on the side table, I realized something didn't add up. This was a woman who had raised 4 sons into success stories, one a corporate attorney in Chicago, one a cardiologist in Dallas, one a tech executive in Silicon Valley, and the youngest a real estate developer with more properties than I could count. Yet here she was, alone, in a place where no one knew her story. I sat beside her, forcing a smile as she turned her head slowly toward me, her eyes lighting up just enough to break my heart. "You came," she said softly, like she hadn't been sure anyone would. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened. Of course I did. But even as I said it, I noticed what wasn't there. No family photos on the wall. No flowers from her sons. No cards, no letters, nothing that suggested she had a family at all. Just a single suitcase tucked neatly under the bed, like she had been told not to unpack. I asked her how long she'd been there, and she paused for a moment before answering, as if the question itself required careful thought. "A few weeks," she said, though something in her voice made it sound longer. Outside her window, I could see the parking lot stretching out under the afternoon sun, empty except for a few scattered cars. "Do they visit?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They're busy," she said, the same excuse she'd probably repeated to herself 100 times. Busy. For grown men with everything they could ever want, and somehow not enough time to sit with their own mother. I looked around the room again, taking in every detail I had missed the first time. The untouched magazines. The neatly folded blanket. The silence that seemed to settle into the walls. And that's when it hit me, not all at once, but slowly, like something coming into focus. This wasn't just about care. This wasn't about safety or health or convenience. This felt like something else entirely. Something deliberate. Because people don't just end up like this, not when they have 4 sons who could easily afford private care, in-home nurses, or even a place of their own choosing. No, this was different. This felt like she had been placed here, like a decision had been made somewhere else, in a room she wasn't invited into. I reached for her hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warm afternoon light streaming through the window. "Aunt Margaret," I said quietly, "did you want to come here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back toward the window, watching something I couldn't see. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't been prepared for. Sometimes, the worst kind of abandonment isn't loud. It doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes, it comes wrapped in polite explanations and quiet decisions made on your behalf. And sometimes, by the time you realize what's happened, you've already been removed from your own life. I stayed longer than I planned that afternoon, long enough to notice the rhythm of the place, the way time seemed to stretch between footsteps in the hallway, the way conversations never quite reached a full sentence before fading into silence. Every so often, a nurse would pass by Margaret's door, offering a polite smile that never lingered, like she was just another name on a schedule rather than a woman who had lived an entire life before arriving here. I asked if she had everything she needed, and she nodded, her eyes still fixed on the window, but I could tell the answer was automatic, something she had practiced until it sounded believable. On the small dresser, beside her bed, there was a stack of unopened mail, neatly aligned, each envelope carrying her name, but none of them opened, as if whatever was inside no longer mattered. I picked one up, noticing it was from a bank, and when I asked about it, she gently took it from my hand and set it back down without looking at it. "They take care of those things now," she said quietly. They. Not her sons by name, just they, like she had already begun to distance herself from them in her own mind. I sat back down, trying to piece together what I was seeing, but nothing quite made sense. This was not neglect in the obvious way. There was no shouting, no visible cruelty, no signs of conflict, just an absence so complete it felt intentional. I asked her about her house, the one she had lived in for over 30 years, the one where every holiday had been celebrated, where every grandchild had taken their first steps. She hesitated again, just for a second, and then said, "It was too much for me to manage." The words sounded rehearsed, like they had been handed to her and repeated until they felt safe. But I remembered that house, every corner of it, and I knew how much it meant to her. She had never once mentioned it being too much, not even when she was tired, not even when she was alone. Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, like I was listening to a story that had been edited down to remove the parts that mattered most. Later, as I walked down the hallway to get her a fresh cup of coffee, I overheard two staff members talking quietly near the nurse's station. They were not trying to be secretive, just speaking in the low, tired voices of people at the end of a long shift. "Room 12, one of them said, glancing at a clipboard. "Family dropped her off and handled everything in one day." The other nodded. "Happens more than you think." I slowed my steps, not enough to draw attention, but enough to listen. "Did she agree to it?" the second one asked. The first shrugged. "Paperwork says she did. Paperwork says she did." The words stayed with me as I returned to Margaret's room, the fresh coffee warming my hands, but doing nothing to ease the chill that had settled in my chest. I looked at her again, really looked this time, at the way she sat so still, at the way she did not reach for the coffee until I placed it directly in her hands, at the way she did not ask any questions about the outside world anymore. It was not just that she had been brought here. It was that she had already begun to disappear inside it. And in that moment, I understood something I had not been ready to admit before. This was not a temporary solution. This was not about giving her time to rest or recover. This was about permanence. About making sure she stayed exactly where she was, quiet, out of the way, and far enough removed that whatever decisions had been made about her life would never be questioned. I pulled my chair closer to her, lowering my voice even though there was no one else in the room. "Aunt Margaret," I said, gently but firmly, "what did you sign?" She did not answer right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup, just enough for me to notice. And then, without looking at me, she said something that made everything feel heavier than it already was. "I signed what they told me would make things easier for everyone." I did not respond right away because there are moments when silence tells you more than any explanation ever could, and this was one of them. I watched her hands instead, the way they rested around that cup like it was the only thing anchoring her to the present. And I realized she was not confused. She was careful in the way people become when they have already been convinced that speaking too much might make things worse. I leaned back slowly and let the quiet settle between us. Because pushing her would only make her retreat further, and after a few seconds I said softly, "What did they tell you it would fix?" She gave a small breath, almost a sigh, and for the first time since I arrived, she looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, like she was measuring whether it was safe to say anything more. "They said the house was too much responsibility," she said, her voice steady, but distant. "They said I should not worry about bills anymore, or maintenance, or paperwork, that they would handle everything if I just made it official." I felt something tighten in my chest again, not sharp, not sudden, just a slow realization settling into place. "Made what official?" I asked. Even though I already had a feeling I knew the answer, she hesitated, then said quietly that I was stepping back. Stepping back, as if a life could be reduced to a phrase like that, as if you could just sign your way out of your own existence. I glanced again at the stack of unopened mail, and then back at her. "Did anyone explain exactly what you were signing?" She shook her head once, small and almost dismissive. "They said it was standard, just something to make things easier if I ever needed help." She paused, then added, "They were in a hurry that day." "In a hurry?" I repeated the words silently in my mind, and suddenly everything about this felt sharper, clearer, like the edges of a picture coming into focus. I thought about 4 grown men standing in that house, papers laid out, voices calm, reassuring, efficient, and a woman who trusted them enough not to question what was being put in front of her. I thought about how easy it would be to guide someone through a decision when you controlled the pace, the language, the urgency, and how quickly something permanent could be framed as temporary if you chose the right words. I looked at her again, really looked this time, and I saw it not as weakness, but as something else, something quieter, a kind of acceptance that had been shaped over time. Not in one moment, but in many small ones, small suggestions, small reassurances, small decisions made for her until she no longer felt like she had to decide anything at all. "Aunt Margaret," I said gently, "when was the last time you went back to the house?" She did not answer right away, and that was answer enough. After a moment she said, "I have not been back since that day," and there it was, not a transition, not a temporary stay, but a line drawn that she had not crossed again. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, needing a second to collect my thoughts because everything inside me was telling me the same thing now. This was not about care, this was about control, about removing her from the center of her own life and placing her somewhere she could not interfere. Somewhere decisions could be made without her presence complicating them. I turned back to her, lowering my voice again. "Did you want to stay?" I asked, and this time she did not look away. She did not hesitate. She did not soften the answer. "No," she said simply, and that single word carried more truth than everything else she had said combined. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it settle into place. Because once you know that, once you understand that someone did not choose where they are, everything else begins to look different. The silence, the distance, the missing pieces, they stop being random and start forming a pattern. And as I stood there in that small room, I realized something else just as important. Whatever had been done, whatever had been signed, whatever decisions had been made, they were counting on one thing above everything else, that no one would come looking closely enough to question it. I did not say anything else after that because once the truth reveals itself, speaking too quickly can blur what needs to stay clear. Instead, I sat back down and let my mind move through the past, not randomly, but carefully. Like sorting through pieces that had never quite fit before. I remembered the last Thanksgiving at her house, the way all 4 of her sons had arrived at different times, but somehow spoke in the same tone, calm, efficient, slightly impatient. I remembered how they had stood in the kitchen discussing things over her head as if she were not even in the room, words like maintenance, liability, and future planning floating through the air while she quietly stirred a pot on the stove. Pretending not to notice that the conversation did not include her anymore, I remembered Daniel checking his watch, Kevin answering calls between bites of food, Brian talking about market timing, Lucas mentioning property values, all of them successful, all of them confident, all of them so certain they knew what was best, and Margaret, standing there in her own kitchen, nodding gently like she was a guest in a house she had built herself. I had noticed it then. But I did not understand it. Not fully, not the way I did now, because back then it still looked like concern, like sons trying to help their mother manage things. But now I could see the shift, the way concern slowly becomes control when no one stops it. The way decisions start getting made without asking, then without informing, then without even acknowledging that someone else should have a say. I looked at her again, sitting by that window, and I realized she had been moved out of her own life long before she ever arrived in this room. It had not happened in one day. It had happened in layers, small changes that felt reasonable at the time, someone else handling the bills, someone else reviewing documents, someone else suggesting what was easier, until one day the center of her life no longer belonged to her at all. "Do you remember signing anything about the house specifically?" I asked quietly, and she nodded, almost absent-mindedly. "They said it would protect me," she replied, "that if anything happened, it would already be taken care of." I felt a slow, steady clarity settle over me, because I had heard that phrase before. Not just from her, but from other people in similar situations, phrases that sound like safety but function like surrender. I stood up again and walked over to the dresser, looking at the envelopes more closely this time. Different banks, different institutions, all addressed to her, all unopened. I picked one up and turned it over, then another, noticing dates from weeks ago, months ago, all of them ignored, not because she did not care, but because somewhere along the way she had been taught that she no longer needed to, that someone else had taken that responsibility from her. I placed them back exactly where they were and turned toward her. "Aunt Margaret," I said, my voice steady now. Not soft in the same way as before, but clear. "When they brought you here, did they say how long you would stay?" She shook her head slowly. "They said it was temporary," she answered, and then after a brief pause added, "until everything was settled." I let that settle in the room for a moment, because sometimes repeating words only weakens them. And these did not need to be repeated to be understood. Temporary until everything was settled, except nothing about this felt temporary. Nothing about this room, this silence, this absence felt like something you passed through on your way back to your life. It felt like an endpoint, carefully disguised as a pause. I pulled my chair closer again and leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes. "And what exactly was being settled?" I asked, and this time, she did not answer at all. She simply looked at me, and in that look there was something I had not seen before. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition, like she was beginning to understand the same thing I had just realized. That whatever had been set in motion was never meant to bring her back. It was meant to make sure she never needed to be asked anything again. The next morning I arrived earlier than I had planned, before visiting hours officially began, because once something starts to feel wrong, waiting only makes it louder in your mind. The front desk attendant barely looked up when I signed in. Just slid the clipboard toward me and nodded, like I had already become part of the routine, another quiet visitor passing through, and that alone told me how easily someone could disappear here without anyone asking questions. I walked down the hallway. Again, slower this time, noticing details I had missed before, room numbers, closed doors, the soft hum of televisions behind them, lives continuing in small, contained spaces, and when I reached Margaret's door, I paused for just a second before stepping inside. She was already awake, sitting in the same chair by the window, wearing the same cardigan from the day before, as if time had not moved at all since I left. "You came early," she said. A hint of surprise in her voice, and I nodded. Setting my bag down on the chair beside her bed, "I wanted to take a look at a few things," I said, keeping my tone even, not wanting to alarm her. She watched me quietly as I moved to the dresser again, this time opening one of the envelopes without asking. The paper inside crisp, official, the kind of document that does not leave room for interpretation. I read it once, then again, slower, letting each word settle. It was a statement, not unusual on its own, but the account name was not just hers. It included another name, Daniel Whitmore, and beneath that, a designation that made everything shift into place, authorized account holder. I felt something cold and steady replace the uncertainty I had been carrying. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. I opened another envelope, then another, each one telling the same story in slightly different ways, different institutions, same pattern, access shared, control extended. Decisions moved just far enough away from her that she no longer had to be consulted. I closed the last envelope carefully and turned back to her. "Did they ever explain what it meant to add their names to your accounts?" I asked, and she shook her head, her expression unchanged. "They said it would make things easier if I needed help paying bills," she replied, and I nodded slowly, because that was exactly how it would have been presented, simple, practical, reasonable. I took a breath and reached into my bag, pulling out my phone, scrolling through a few numbers until I found the one I needed. I stepped just outside the room, not because I wanted to hide anything from her, but because I needed to hear clearly. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Michael Grant," he said, professional, calm, the same tone he had used for years. "Michael, it is me," I said, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in. I was wondering when someone would call. He replied quietly, and that sentence alone told me more than anything else could have. You knew, I said, not as a question, but he answered anyway. I knew something did not feel right when I was no longer included in the conversations, he said, but I could not act without being asked. I leaned against the wall, keeping my voice low. I am asking now, I said, and there was no hesitation in his response. Then we need to review everything immediately, he said. Starting with what she signed, I glanced back into the room, where Margaret sat exactly as I had left her, still, patient, waiting, and I realized how much had been decided without her even knowing it. I will bring everything to you, I said, ending the call and stepping back inside. She looked at me, searching my face for something she could not quite name, and I sat down beside her again, this time closer than before. We are going to take a closer look at what they asked you to sign, I said gently, and for the first time since I arrived, something shifted in her expression, not fear, not confusion, but something quieter. Something that had been buried under all those careful explanations. Do you think I made a mistake? She asked softly, and I held her gaze, steady and certain. No, I said. I think you trusted the wrong people. That afternoon I gathered everything I could find, every envelope, every document, every small piece of paper that had been quietly set aside as if it no longer mattered. And I placed them carefully into my bag because suddenly they mattered more than anything else. Margaret watched me without asking questions, and that told me she already understood that something was wrong, not in a dramatic way, not with panic, but with a quiet awareness that had likely been building long before I arrived. I told her I would be back the next day, and she simply nodded, the same way she had nodded when her sons spoke to her, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like she was waiting for something to change, not accepting that nothing would. I left the nursing home with a kind of focus that does not come from emotion but from clarity, and I drove straight to Michael Grant's office, the same office her husband had trusted for decades, the same place where decisions used to be explained to her, not made for her. Michael was already waiting when I arrived, his desk cleared, his expression serious in a way that told me he had already begun to prepare for what he expected to find. I placed the documents in front of him without speaking and watched as he began to go through them one by one, slowly, carefully, his eyes moving across each page with the kind of attention that only comes from experience. He did not react at first. Not outwardly, but I could see the subtle changes, the slight tightening of his jaw, the pause that lasted a fraction longer than usual, and then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. They did not just simplify things, he said, his voice calm but firm. They transferred control. I felt the words settle into place. Not surprising anymore, just confirmed. How much? I asked, and he turned one of the documents toward me, pointing to a section I had not fully understood before. This is a durable power of attorney, he explained. It allows them to make financial decisions on her behalf, not just assist, but act as her. I stared at the paper, reading the language again, seeing it now for what it was, not protection, not convenience, but authority. Did she give up ownership? I asked, and he shook his head slightly. Not directly, he said, but with this, they do not need to take ownership. They can control everything without changing the title. That was the part that made it even more precise. They had not taken what was hers in a way that could be easily challenged. They had simply placed themselves in a position where they no longer needed her consent, and the house. I asked, and he opened another file, one he had already pulled from his records. The house is still legally hers, he said, but it has been listed for sale. I felt something shift again, sharper this time. Listed by who? I asked. Even though I already knew, Lucas, he replied, using the authority granted in this document. I stood there for a moment, letting that settle, because it meant everything I had been feeling was not just suspicion, it was structure. It was deliberate, it was organized, for men who understood exactly what they were doing and had chosen the cleanest way to do it. No confrontation, no conflict, just paperwork and timing. Can we stop it? I asked, and Michael did not hesitate. Yes, he said, but we need her to act, not as someone being helped, but as someone taking back control. I nodded slowly, already understanding what that meant. It would not be loud, it would not be emotional. It would be precise, just like what had been done to her. I gathered the documents again, more carefully this time, and looked at him. What is the first step? I asked, and he met my gaze directly. We remind them that she is still the one who decides, he said, and for the first time since I walked into that nursing home, I felt something steady and certain take its place. Not anger, not even satisfaction. Just the quiet understanding that whatever had been set in motion could be undone, not by force, but by the same thing that had been used against her in the first place, the truth written in the same language they thought she would never question. The next morning I returned to the nursing home with a different kind of energy, not rushed, not anxious, but deliberate, because once you understand the structure of something, you stop reacting to it and start moving through it with intention. Margaret noticed the change immediately, not in what I said, but in how I carried myself, and as I sat down beside her, I placed the folder gently on the small table between us, not hiding it, not presenting it dramatically, just letting it exist there. I spoke with Michael, I said calmly, and she nodded once, waiting. He reviewed everything, I continued, and he confirmed something important. I paused just long enough for her to focus. You did not give anything away, I said. You only allowed them to act for you. She blinked slightly, as if processing the difference between those two ideas, and I could see it begin to settle. So I still own everything, she asked quietly, and I nodded. Yes, I said, but they have been making decisions as if you do not. She looked down at her hands again, but this time it was not the same stillness as before. There was movement there now, small but real, like something inside her had shifted just enough to respond. What does that mean? She asked. And I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice steady. It means nothing has been taken from you yet, I said, but it also means they are counting on you not changing anything. I let that sit between us, because the truth does not need to be rushed. It needs to be understood. They think I will not question it, she said after a moment, not as a question, but as a realization, and I nodded again. They think you will accept it, I replied, that you will stay here, that you will not look at the documents, that you will not call anyone. She lifted her eyes to meet mine, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in her expression, not confusion, not resignation, but awareness, clear and steady. And if I do? She asked, and I felt a small shift in the room, almost imperceptible but real. Then everything changes, I said, just as calmly as before. She looked at the folder again, then back at me. What do I need to do? She asked, and the question itself told me everything I needed to know. Because it was no longer about what had been done to her, it was about what she was willing to do next. I opened the folder slowly and turned the first document toward her, pointing to the section Michael had highlighted. This is where you gave them authority, I explained, and this is where you can take it back. She leaned in slightly, reading the lines more carefully than she had probably read anything in weeks, maybe months, and I could see the difference, the way she was no longer skimming, no longer trusting that someone else had already understood it for her. She was reading it herself, and that alone felt like the first real change. I can revoke this, she asked, and I nodded. Yes, I said, at any time. She sat back slowly, the paper still in her hands, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because sometimes the most important part is not the answer, it is the space after it, the moment where a person decides whether they will accept what has been done or change it. I watched her carefully, not pushing, not interrupting, just letting her sit with it, and then she did something small, something that would have gone unnoticed a day ago. She straightened her shoulders slightly and placed the document back on the table. Not carefully the way she had been placing things before, but deliberately, like it belonged there because she decided it did. I want to change it, she said, and her voice was quiet, but it was no longer distant. It was present, grounded, and certain in a way it had not been before, and in that moment I understood something just as clearly as everything else we had uncovered. They had never expected her to say that, not because she could not, but because they believed she would not. We did not rush after that moment because rushing would have made it feel like panic, and panic was exactly what they expected from her if she ever questioned anything. Instead, we moved carefully, step by step, the way they had, but with one difference, everything we did was in full awareness, not hidden behind soft words or quiet assumptions. Michael prepared the revocation documents that same afternoon and brought them directly to the nursing home, not as a dramatic entrance, but as a simple visit, another person walking down that same quiet hallway, except this time the purpose was different. Margaret sat straighter when he entered, not because she needed to impress him, but because she recognized what he represented. A return to something she had been removed from, a place where her voice still mattered. He explained everything slowly, clearly, without rushing her, pointing to each section, each line, making sure she understood not just what she was signing, but what it meant. And I watched her as she listened, not the way she had listened before, not nodding to keep things moving, but pausing, asking questions, reading each word, and for the first time since I had seen her in that room, she was not being guided. She was deciding. If I sign this, she said, looking at Michael, they will not be able to act for me anymore, and he nodded. That is correct, he replied. All authority returns to you. She looked at the paper again, then at her hands. And for a brief moment I could see the weight of it, not fear, but the realization that everything that had been quietly taken out of her control was still within reach if she chose to take it back. And then, without hesitation, she signed. Not quickly, not nervously, but with a steady hand that did not shake, and when she finished, she placed the pen down in a way that felt final, not as an ending, but as a shift. Michael collected the documents and nodded once. I will file this immediately, he said. And I will notify all relevant institutions. There was no need to explain what that meant. We all understood. Within hours, the structure they had built would begin to change. Not visibly at first, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the places that mattered most. Access would be restricted, decisions would require approval, processes that had moved smoothly before would stop, and questions would begin to surface. Margaret sat quietly after he left, her hands resting in her lap again, but this time the stillness was different. It was not the stillness of waiting, it was the stillness of someone who had just made a decision and was prepared to see what came next. They will notice, she said after a moment, and I nodded. Yes, I replied, they will. She looked toward the window again. But her gaze was no longer distant, it was focused, grounded. What will they do? She asked, and I took a breath before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted her to understand that whatever came next was not something to fear. They will try to understand what changed, I said, and when they cannot, they will come here. She nodded slowly, as if that possibility had already crossed her mind, and then she said something that made it clear just how much had shifted. Then I will be here, she said, simple, calm, certain, and I realized in that moment that this room, which had felt like a place she had been placed into, was now something else entirely. Not a cage, not a waiting room, but a point of control, because for the first time since she arrived, she was no longer the one being managed. She was the one deciding what would happen next, and somewhere beyond those walls. For men who believed everything had already been settled were about to discover that nothing had been settled at all. They came sooner than I expected, not days later, not after long deliberation, but the very next afternoon, because control does not fade quietly when it is interrupted. It reacts. It demands to know why. I was sitting beside Margaret when we heard footsteps in the hallway, not the slow, routine pace of staff, but something faster, more direct, and when the door opened, all four of them stood there, Daniel in front, the others just behind him. Their expressions controlled but tight, like something had already begun to unravel and they were trying to hold it together before anyone else could see. Mom, Daniel said, stepping into the room as if he still owned the space. We need to talk. Margaret did not move right away. She did not stand. Did not rush to greet them. She simply looked at them the way she had looked at the documents the day before, carefully, fully, without avoiding anything. Then talk, she said, her voice calm, and it was that calm that shifted the room before anything else did. They exchanged quick glances, subtle but unmistakable, as if something about her response did not match what they had prepared for. Kevin stepped forward next, his tone softer. Practiced. "We have been getting calls," he said, "from the bank, from the agent handling the house. They said there have been changes." He paused, watching her closely. "Did you sign something?" Margaret rested her hands in her lap, the same position as before, but everything about her felt different now, grounded, present. "Yes," she said simply, no explanation, no hesitation, just the truth placed between them. Brian let out a short breath. Not quite frustration, not quite disbelief. "Mom, you should have told us," he said. "We were handling everything," and there it was again, the same language, the same assumption that had carried them this far, but this time it did not settle the way it used to. Margaret looked at him steadily. "That is exactly the problem," she said, and the room went quiet in a way it had not before. Lucas shifted his weight slightly, stepping closer to the foot of the bed. "We did this for you," he said. His voice firmer now. "The house, the accounts, all of it was getting complicated. We were trying to make things easier." Margaret did not raise her voice, did not react emotionally. She simply reached over to the small table and picked up the folder. Opening it with the same deliberate movement she had used earlier, she slid one document forward, not toward any one of them in particular, just placing it where all of them could see. "This is what I signed," she said, and Daniel stepped closer, his eyes scanning the page quickly, then again more slowly, and I watched the exact moment recognition settled in. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. The structure they had relied on had shifted. "You revoked it," he said, "and it was not a question." Margaret nodded once. "Yes," she replied, and Kevin's expression changed. Not anger, but calculation, like he was already trying to adjust. "Mom, we should have discussed this," he said carefully. "These decisions affect all of us." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said, just as calmly as before. "They affect me," and that was the moment everything stopped pretending to be wet. It was not the room, the conversation, the roles they had all been playing. It all settled into something clearer, something simpler. Daniel straightened slightly, his tone shifting back to something more formal, more controlled. "We only wanted to protect you," he said, and Margaret gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "You did not protect me," she said. "You removed me." No accusation, no raised voice, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be, and for the first time since they arrived, none of them spoke immediately, because there are moments when the truth does not need to be argued. It just needs to be heard. Margaret closed the folder gently and rested her hands on top of it, not defensively, not possessively, but with quiet certainty. "You made your decisions," she continued. "Now I have made mine." And as they stood there, looking at her, not the way they had looked at her before, not as someone to manage, but as someone they could no longer control, I understood something just as clearly as everything that had led us here. They had never expected her to change anything, and now that she had, they did not know how to move forward without her doing exactly what she had just decided she would never do again.